Rick Grenell, our Senior Advisor for Foreign Policy and National Security. Rick, we've seen a flip-flop now from the World Health Organization reporting now that, and China not happy about it, but that their Director General does now believe that there was a leak from the Wuhan lab that was a, quote, caused by a catastrophic accident is what they're saying in 2019 that led to the worldwide COVID pandemic. This, of course, goes against the Chinese talking points that the COVID pandemic originated in the United States. But I want to ask you, Rick, do you think the significance, I mean, there's a lot of questions about, I like a lot of parts about the World Health Organization, but something went on there where they were willing to make us put out these statements. They're calling for a reinvestigation as well, though 3 years after the fact is pretty difficult. But, there's got to be a reason why behind they're willing to challenge China on this now.
Look, there's a long history of the Chinese controlling the World Health Organization through the elections at the UN. They have really tried to implement their Chinese strategy of controlling UN agencies, and they've done a pretty good job of it. In April of 2020, during the Trump administration, when I was acting Director of National Intelligence, we issued a statement, an IC-wide, an intelligence community-wide statement, saying that the Wuhan virus, the coronavirus, it all started in Wuhan, and it was because of two possibilities. And this was an intelligence-wide assessment. One was animal to human transmission. The other was the Wuhan lab. We knew at the time that the Wuhan lab was the likely place. That has only increased over the years. For WHO to come around now and finally come to the assessment that we've known for years just signifies that they are not paying attention to real facts. They're controlled by the Chinese, and they finally really couldn't bear the embarrassment of continuing down this road of denying the facts. Every country, even the Germans and the Europeans now, are literally looking at the facts and understanding them. And so they were endangered of really losing the credibility of the rest of the world if they didn't catch up. It was sheer embarrassment for WHO to completely change their thinking.
Yeah, and I think they should be embarrassed because, as you said, there were so many different countries and international organizations and individuals just looking at it, scientists looking at it and saying, okay, how likely it would be this, how much more likely it could be this out of this lab. But then we see the Chinese response. While the World Health Organization wants to do more research and investigation into this, I mean, it doesn't seem like, Rick, we can expect much from China to let those investigators in. And at this point, if probably anything that's relevant, unfortunately, has been destroyed, including the people.
One thing to just note is that the UN seldom does any research on its own. It's really a compilation of countries. And so what WHO is going to rely on are member states, countries' intelligence. And so they're going to be looking at the United States intelligence. They should have been looking more closely over the last 2 years. By the way, you can go to the DNI website, and that intelligence community-wide statement is still on the DNI website. It's been there since April of 2020. So it's important for us to push international organizations like the UN and others to read the facts and respond and not be so political. They've allowed the Chinese to take over the whole process, and therefore there hasn't really been a real investigation. And I doubt we'll ever get one. Remember that it took the UN a couple of years to come forward and say that the Syrians had used chemical weapons against its people. We had the facts. Every country knew this already. We could see the video evidence, but the UN was like 2 or 3 years late. So they're never going to be at the forefront.
You know, Rick, part of this too was that this was kind of the beginning of that disinformation online, that if you question the World Health Organization, if you posted that, hey, maybe this wasn't out of a market in Wuhan, but in fact was lab generated. And even if you put the caveats of unintentional or negligence and not necessarily intentionally done, you were flagged on social media. This was something banned from social media. You could get your account shut down if you kept putting it out there. Certainly you could be put in Facebook or Twitter jail over this. And it kind of points to me, at the same time, the Biden administration wants to give more disinformation power to WHO when they are changing their mind. And it, to me, this should have been something that it's just you're allowed to have an open and free debate about, especially when there isn't a 100% conclusion on how this occurred, because of how important it still is to the world, the impact it's still having on the world, unfortunately.
Jordan, that's such a great point, because in reality, we were bending, the world and big tech was bending to the Chinese propaganda. Remember that the Chinese in the very beginning blamed the Italians for COVID-19. Then they tried to blame the US military. So they were literally throwing disinformation out there. And it was just a few short months later that the Chinese were celebrating the Democrats and the Joe Biden campaign for saying that Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation. The one country that doesn't want you to look at Hunter Biden's laptop is China. They don't want you to see the details of the Biden family intermingling with Chinese businessmen and Chinese officials. It's all about money. And so we have bent to the Chinese propaganda in the United States under the Biden administration way too much. And this is yet another example where even the UN now is coming around and blaming Wuhan for this COVID-19 outbreak. And yet, if you talk about it in America, there's still woke people who will call you a racist for saying that. It's really a disinformation campaign targeting dissenting information.
Yeah, and I want to stay on China for a bit more, because it uniquely now, Russia, bring them into the fold, is now the number one supplier of oil to China. It used to be, they displaced Saudi Arabia. So that relationship continuing to get closer as the world watches not only what's going on in Ukraine, but what the Chinese might do in Taiwan. And it just seems like, again, they're more reliant on Russia. They're building up a much closer relationship, and they are in line with each other's foreign policy. And so, Rick, what do you make of the fact that now Russia is the number one supplier to China when the rest of the world tried to cut Russia off?
Look, the Western alliance, the Western countries really did a good job in the beginning of trying to implement these sanctions. It took the Europeans way too long to come around, but they did. But we've got a problem now with countries that are going around the international sanctions. And it's not just China, it's also India. So the Russians are very pleased that they're still able to sell, and they're able to sell around the sanctions. I saw a couple of reports where Putin was saying, and some of this is spin and propaganda, but he was claiming that the sanctions have done nothing to harm the Russian economy. Now, we know that that's not true, but the larger point taken is that they are surviving these sanctions. We have not been able to grip them enough, and now the Russians are getting money by selling oil to countries that are ignoring the international sanctions.
Yeah, and if that continues to occur, how concerned are you about then potential action in Taiwan? I mean, I think that's the other major international focus right now, is that some people thought, well, since Russia's kind of had a tougher time in Ukraine, maybe that's given the Chinese pause, but it certainly seems like their buildup continues, their threats continue, and the way they're treating the rest of the world is with pretty nasty rhetoric.
Well, to really dig deep into this relationship, I think that you're going to have to see that the Chinese are going to be very duplicitous. They're going to pretend like they are trying to abide by the international sanctions. They're going to pretend to not be too close to the Russians, but we're going to see them not only buying Russian energy and oil, but they're also going to take the lesson that there are countries like India and others that will go around the sanctions. And so this is a way for the Chinese to say, if we calculate that we're going to do something in Taiwan, whether it's militarily or just a crackdown of some sort, we can rely on some other countries to go around the sanctions. We don't have to assume that there will be worldwide sanctions against us. That's a scary lesson. And I think that the Biden administration is going to have to start playing a bigger, tougher game with countries like India. Remember, we don't have a U.S. ambassador to India. because the mayor of LA is not being able to be confirmed. I think we should move on and try to find somebody to get them there as quickly as possible.
I mean, this is way too long an administration not to have an ambassador to a major country like that. I mean, it's a world power. It's a nuclear power. It's important economically to the U.S., important in the region. Rick, as always, I appreciate your insight and, of course, the additional insight, too. Like facts like that don't make front page news, that there's no U.S. ambassador to India right now when we're talking about all of these issues.